All right. All right. Today I'm speaking with Amy Gallagher. And Amy, your new documentary is called Trans, Racist, and Woke: How Psychology Went Mad. And I've watched it twice. I think it's
Oh, really?
excellent. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Well, this is a really important topic to me. And it's interesting. Right after I started posting videos about my experience in school as a graduate student in a counseling program, people started saying, "You've got to talk to Amy Gallagher." So
Oh, really?
yeah, I'm glad to finally
Oh,
have the
God.
opportunity. So
Oh, wow.
would you say a little bit about yourself and how you found yourself in the position to be making a documentary like this?
Yeah. I'm a mental health nurse in the UK. I've been working in the NHS for about 10 years now. I've worked with adolescents, I've worked with adults, I've worked with eating disorders, I've worked with psychosis, I've worked with obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, sort of you name it, really. But I always like the kind of talking side, the therapy side of things. I started training to become a psychodynamic psychotherapist. It's a kind of 4-year training in the UK. And I did the first 2 years at the Tavistock, which is a psychotherapy clinic and training organization. And I graduated with a kind of diploma, and then I returned to the Tavistock to do my final 2 years there to qualify as a psychodynamic psychotherapist. And that's kind of where the trouble began quite quickly. So yeah, I don't know if I should tell the whole story or if you, yeah.
Sure, please.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So I guess the issue was very quickly, it was kind of obvious that they were quite woke, and I was sort of I'm very kind of a liberal, tolerant person. So I was sort of thinking, okay, I can see that a lot of these ideas are kind of identity based, but that's their thing, and as long as they don't push it onto me, that's fine. Um, so I just kind of went you know, into lectures and seminars with an open mind. And I wouldn't want to stop anyone from thinking the way that they thought. I guess the first thing I noticed was that so I was pulled into a lecture about, it's titled Race and Racism. And the lecturer was essentially making, I would say, very broad brush statements about Christianity. So I'm a Christian, and she was
Mm,
saying that Christianity was racist because it was European. There's a
mm,
lot of emphasis on Christianity being negative. There was a lot of the lecture was about Black Lives Matter and politics, and I was sort of thinking, but this isn't psychotherapy. There
mhm.
wasn't much reference to kind of psychological studies or anything like that. Um, and then at the end, because at the end there was a room for questions, and I kind of remarked that the lecture had seemed quite political. Um, and that I said, I'm a Christian myself, and I kind of explained why I didn't think she was right about Christianity being racist. And I was kind of expecting that there would be a kind of mediation, or she might sort of say, "Oh yeah, sorry about that," and we'd move on, And
Mhm.
because I think it's always important to make these points, because I think if no one says it, then it's never challenged. So
Mhm.
I was expecting maybe just a bit of back and forth conversation, and she was, "Oh yeah, maybe I didn't mean it in that way," and I'd say, "Oh yeah, fine, don't worry
Mhm.
about it." But there was a kind of reaction to me in the group, and it was these were sessions that were online, like over Zoom, was that I just said something absolutely awful. There was a kind of a sudden, like, it was like I was thinking, hang on, I've just asked a question. I'm a student. What I haven't said anything offensive. There was just a general atmosphere of I shouldn't have questioned this lecturer at all.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I thought, okay. So that happened. And then several days later, there was an email sent round advertising a lecture that was to mark 100 years of the Tavistock, and it was kind of, they were advertising it heavily. And the title of the lecture was Whiteness, a Problem for Our Time. And I thought, gosh, okay, that sounds, I mean, that sounds to me to be quite racist. It sounds like something you'd expect from out of critical race theory.
Mhm.
Um, but again, I sort of thought, well, maybe they've chosen a provocative title, but actually maybe the lecture is more nuanced. So I watched the lecture, and it wasn't nuanced. it was kind of an hour of critical race theory with no balance, and it was presenting critical race theory as though it was the truth. So it was just making statements like that white privilege is a reality. It was saying things like white people don't understand the world, essentially arguing that all white people are racist, even white children are racist, and that the colorblind approach is kind of racist. That the colorblind approach to race, i.e., trying not to, judging everyone as equals and as individuals, that was wrong, and actually was potentially traumatic to not notice a person's race was a negative thing to do. And I was kind of familiar with these ideas. I did a degree in English before. I trained as a nurse, and I learned about critical theory through my degree. But I was so surprised that this was being taught on a clinical training course, and there wasn't even a kind of well, this is a theory, and there's good things about it, there's bad things about it, and you can agree with it or disagree with it. It was just like, this is the facts, and if you disagree with it, that's because you've got some kind of issue, you're defensive, or you don't want to face your own racism. And I was just thinking, oh my God, they've gone mad. I just thought it's just crazy. So in response to this, I wrote an email in response, essentially saying, I hope you realise that these are a set of ideas, and that some of our patients that we will treat will not like these ideas. We may be treating Black or white or Asian people who don't think in this way. Many people find it racist. There's many different views. And as clinicians, we need to be aware that there's different views. Like, these are quite radical ideas. So I just sort of I felt like I needed to say it. And after that, again, there was this immediately, and a kind of a sense that I'd done something wrong. So I got pulled into a meeting quite quickly with the course lead. Said essentially, she was saying, we need to talk about your reaction to that lecture. And in the meeting, she essentially said, that I'd been inappropriate for speaking out, and there was a kind of tone of, well, how are we going to manage this going forward? How are we going to manage you with your views? And I was saying, well, hang on a minute. I believe in not judging people by the color of their skin. I believe in treating people equally. I believe in not being prejudiced, and I subscribe to the colorblind approach. That's my view, and I don't like these ideas. That's, she essentially said that the colorblind approach was discredited and it was outdated, and essentially that these views that were voiced in this lecture about white privilege and whiteness were representative of the whole training organisation as a whole. So there was an idea that basically I wouldn't be able to go forward on this course because I had different views. And I was saying, well, I can't change my views. And there was a kind of sense of, well, we're going to be watching you from now on going forward, So I was so shocked about this. I was thinking, hang on. And the Tavistock as an organisation calls itself an anti-racist organisation, and we've been told that we should stand up to racism when we see it. And I think, well, I've noticed racism. You've sent me a lecture that seems to be racist, and I'm doing what you've told me to do. I'm challenging the racism. And now I'm being sort of disciplined for it. So I thought about it, and I thought, what am I going to do here? Am I going to just let this go? Or am I going to challenge it further? And I thought, well, I can't really, I didn't feel myself that I could continue on this course and let this slide. So I wrote an official complaint, and I just essentially said, here's the lecture, here's the quotes that it says in the lecture, here's why they're racist, here's the definition of racism, here's why I think you've said and done things that are racist, here's the Equality Act that we are supposed to adhere to. And I thought, let's see what they say. To begin with, they said they were taking it seriously and they were going to investigate it. They did an investigation. They met with me. They said they met with various other people, the lecturers, and then they sent me this investigation outcome report, where it essentially said, essentially saying that I was the problem. So they said that they'd actually realised that the theory of whiteness as a system of power and privilege needs to be written into their policies more, not less, and that they encourage all their students to interrogate whiteness, and that I'd shown an inability to learn. and I needed to be given a space to come to terms with these ideas. And in a very patronizing way, they said, we know it can be difficult to come to terms with, and we know it can be, these ideas are very complicated, and it's very difficult, but you need to sort of be on board with them, essentially. And I was just shocked. I couldn't believe it. And while they were doing this, they were continuing to send reading material of Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility, and reading material that just said similar stuff, just similar kind of racist, overt generalizations about Black people, about white people, and about Christianity again as well. So it came to the end of the course term, and I was asked in a seminar how I felt the term was going by the course lead, and I said, well, I don't, I've said my views about the ideas that are being taught, and I don't like this recent reading material. And I explained why I thought it was racist, and I explained why I thought it was an ideology and not psychotherapy. And essentially she reacted, it was like I'd said something like the most outrageous thing. I mean, there's a one point where she was like taking deep breaths because she was so affected by what I was saying. And I was thinking, I'm just using a logical argument here. I'm a student, and I'm explaining to you my understanding of the ideas that you're teaching. And after that happened, they raised a student conduct policy against me. They essentially said if I continued to speak in an inappropriate way about race, which I then challenged because I said, well, what have I actually said that's inappropriate about race? And they later said it wasn't what you said, it was the tone of your voice that was wrong. So they said that if you continue to speak inappropriately about race, it could potentially affect your continuation on the course, and we could prevent you from entering the profession of psychotherapy. They sent a letter to my house explaining that. And they raised this conduct policy against me, essentially giving me a warning. And that was the point where I thought, okay, I need to consult with lawyers here, because it felt very much like I was like given a warning. Anything could be used against me at this point. It felt like all the staff were against me, and I felt like I'm being pushed out of this profession that I've worked really hard to go into. And yeah, so from that point onwards, there was more of the same, more stuff about coming up about whiteness in the lectures. In one lecture, they described psychoanalytic theories as white theories. And at this point, I was trying to be as I thought, I've got to really be careful what I say. I can't, I just very politely asked, how can a theory be white? Can you please explain to me what that means? Didn't raise my voice, just said it as I said to you now. Apparently that lecturer subsequently said that she felt attacked and she couldn't return to teach. That's when I spoke. After that, I was speaking with lawyers, and I raised a claim against them for discrimination on the basis of, well, race, because they kept telling me I needed to interrogate my whiteness, my religious discrimination, but also for the philosophical belief of believing in the colorblind approach, because essentially I was being given a warning that I can't continue with those beliefs. I sort of thought that once they kind of got the sense that I was speaking to lawyers and I was going to raise a claim against them, that they would back off. They didn't. I just couldn't believe it. One lecturer went as far as to report. So I was training to be a psychotherapist, but alongside that, I was working as a nurse. And one lecturer went so far as to contact the Nursing and Midwifery Council, which is my regulatory body as a nurse, and essentially say that I shouldn't be able to continue working as a nurse. I'd shown that I was incapable of working with diverse patients. I'd caused race-based harm. And this was a similar time when I decided to get some media attention for my story, because I needed to raise money for my lawyers. So I got kind of story in the UK press about it. Very fortunately, people donated, which was amazing, so I could continue with the legal case. But still, from that point onwards, they continued to bully me, essentially. I was told that, so the one particular lecturer that was bullying me, I asked the CEO of the trust if I could I didn't want to have supervision with, I didn't want to have one-to-one sessions with her. The CEO said, yeah, okay, that's fine. We know there's an issue there. She continued to try and put pressure on me to have supervision sessions with her, even though the CEO had told me that I didn't have to. Then eventually they stopped me from seeing one of my patients. I'd done an 18-month clinical work with one patient, and that's gone really well. He came to every session. All my progress reports in terms of my clinical work were saying I was doing good work with patients. I started the second training with my second patient, which was what I needed to do to qualify. And very early into that, they stopped that work, and they said that I was unsafe to work with that patient. And the reason that they gave was that on one occasion, I was in a session with a patient, and there's a really loud noise going on next door. And it was interfering with the session. So I knocked on the door and asked if the noise could be lowered because it was affecting my session with my patient. And they said that I'd traumatized the people in the room for knocking on the door and interrupting. They said that I should therefore no longer be present in the reception area because the people in the room would be re-traumatized if they saw the sight of my face again. So I was moved down to the basement. I had to see my patient in the basement and I was told not to be present in the reception area. And then I was pulled into a meeting with the director of the clinic, who's also my supervisor, and I told her that I was also getting harassing messages from the course lead. So the course lead was sending me messages on social media. She sent me just messages with dots in, and she tried to video call me, and I believe that she called me and was breathing down the phone and then hung up, and I explained this to the director of the clinic, and then several days later after that, the director of the clinic stopped my work with my patient and told me there would be an investigation into me because it was felt I was unsafe to be with patients because I knocked on a door.
Wow.
And yes, this was like but I was at this point because I was so close to finishing, and I'd done all the seminars and I'd gotten through it, and I was thinking I just need to finish this work with this patient and then I could be rid of these people and I can qualify. And then when, I told the director that I was being harassed, and I told her what was happening. I said, I'm literally serving court documents this week because of the harassment I've experienced. And then literally a week later, she stopped me from seeing the patient. And I, at that point, I couldn't believe that so many people were kind of hounding me out of this institute. I couldn't believe how they were behaving. And that was kind of the worst point for me. It really affected my own mental health, and I was having panic attacks and all sorts. And yeah, then after that happened, then I just sort of thought I didn't want to be in the media too much because I wanted to remain sort of professional and private. But when they said they'd investigate me, and they didn't. So after they stopped my work, my patient, I said, okay, you said you're going to investigate me. When is this investigation happening? Literally, that was over 2 years ago. There hasn't been an investigation. My lawyers have written to them and said, when is the investigation? Only now are they saying they want to meet with me with a professional panel to determine whether I can continue, even though it was 2 years ago. So yeah, my legal case is ongoing. It looks likely to go to trial. But the charges that I'm bringing against them, among all the discrimination that I've said, is also the victimization, because they knew that I was bringing a court case against them, and then they subsequently denied me the qualification. So it's bullying and victimization as well as discrimination. But it's meant that I have still yet to work as a psychotherapist. I'm still working as a nurse, but it's totally derailed all my plans with psychotherapy. So since then, I've sort of ended up kind of being in the media a bit more and talking about these issues, which I'm still quite shy, really. I'm still getting used to talking on camera and things like that, but I've grown more confident about talking about it, and I've done some interviews, and now recently I did a documentary about to try to explain what I think is going on and why we've got to where we've got to. But yeah, that's kind of my story. So people now know me as someone that kind of talks about mental health and talks about politics and culture a little bit in the UK, but I'm still very much someone that's sort of been cancelled and is very disappointed and upset that I didn't get to do what I wanted to do, because I was quite good at it, and they were even saying that I was good at it. So yeah, that's kind of my story.
What year was it that you started to experience this in school, and what was the duration? How long was this going on? Because it sounds like it was coming pretty persistently throughout this part of the program.
Yeah, so it was 2020.
Okay.
It was the end of 2020 that I started, and that was very soon. I was experiencing this ideology that they were pushing onto me. I was there for 2 years, and at the end of the 2 years that I was just about to finish with my second patient, and that's when they stopped my clinical work. Yeah, and now we're 2024 now, so
Mm.
yeah, it's still ongoing, and the legal case is still ongoing.
There's so many like different aspects of your story that I kind of want to talk to you about, but it's similar in some ways to what I experienced. I went back to school in 2019 and I entered a master's in counseling program. It was a clinical mental health counseling program. And it was supposed to be a three-ish year program. Some people do it a little faster, some people take longer, but I was it there was so much contradiction in this curriculum, in the program. There was some of it that was so overtly political, like you're talking about. I had a teacher who told us that white women's tears have been overvalued, and with the implication that we need to work to equalize that and not give so much attention to sad white women. And on and on. We did this addressing model where we dissected people by intersectional oppression and determined if we were more oppressed than our client. And we were told that we were supposed to see the counseling, our patients as clinical opportunities to increase their racial salience, racial identity salience. So we had a lot of the same stuff, but mine was most of what I experienced was all in one course, this one course that was called Multicultural Perspectives. And so this course was like a meme. It was like it's when you describe that first lecture that you were talking about, where you're online and it felt really political, and you spoke up and said, well, I'm a Christian. What about this? Was kind of like the experience I had in this one course. I brought up the question about, so I pushed back on some of the ideas about whiteness that were being shared. And at one point, my teacher actually broke down crying and said that she couldn't it wasn't a safe space. So it was like this, it's very similar. I've talked about this quite a bit, and I'm kind of glossing over it because I know people have already heard my story, but you maybe have not. So, but one of the things that I heard when I started to talk more publicly about this, I felt like people needed to understand that when you go see a counselor right now, you may be seeing someone who's been trained with this perspective and not the old school, what we would have thought of classically as psychotherapy or counseling. You might be seeing someone who sees themselves, as we were told to be, first and foremost as an activist for social justice.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started talking about this, and one of the things that I heard was, you went to a really extreme school. Your school is an outlier, that your case is unique. Those counselors are being trained in this one particular way, and that doesn't apply across the board. And something that your story highlights is what you're talking about is even more extreme than what I'm talking about. This was so much more overt for you. You tried to talk about it, and you got it over and over again at different layers of the program, at different levels of administration, it sounds like. And they were much more forceful with this ideology. And in the UK, where I would have thought, in the US, we have a long history of racial issues and tensions, and it kind of makes sense a little bit more given our history, our social history. But it's really surprising to hear that was happening in the UK, where Europeans are indigenous. That's the whole idea. So so it's and I know you just had Brexit a few years ago. There's been tension there as well. I don't know as much about the political background, but I am still very surprised to hear that it's so overt there.
Yeah, it was I mean, I was aware that ideas like critical race theory and Robin DiAngelo were happening in America, and I was sort
Mhm.
of looking over at America and was thinking, God, they've gone too far. And
Mhm.
maybe in Britain we're a bit more mild, and I don't think that would happen here. And as you say, you've got a different history with
Mhm.
race. But it was like we just sort of cut and paste it and just put it
Mhm.
onto everything in the UK. And it didn't it just totally didn't make sense because all of the George Floyd stuff
Mhm.
just doesn't apply here. Like we don't have people being shot, we don't have guns here. Like the Tavistock did a 9-minute silence of remembrance for the 9 minutes that George Floyd was on the floor or something. And I was just thinking, but that's something that happened in a different country.
Mhm.
Our policing is totally different. Our racial history, as you say, is totally different. So it's like it was even more insane.
Mhm.
I think it's even, I mean, I think it's crazy what's happening in the US, but even like to then apply it to the UK. And I think what you were saying as well about people saying, oh, that's just you're on a particularly radical course. People did say that to me because the Tavistock has now become quite infamous because of its gender identity service, which has since been shut down. And there was a lot of lawsuits, and one patient actually brought a lawsuit against them because of they had puberty blockers and went on to regret it.
Mhm.
So the Tavistock has sort of now got a name for itself as the kind of the place, the place in the UK where the ideology is totally taken over. But actually, what I've found since I've been speaking out in the media, I've had lots of people in different courses contact me and say we're experiencing exactly the same thing. Even people have sent me stuff that's even worse, where I thought, gosh, that's even more of a there was a psychologist in the UK, Carol Sherwood, who looked
Mhm.
into this, and she found that she did a Freedom of Information request, and she looked at what's being taught on clinical psychology trainings up and down the UK, and kind of decolonization and whiteness and challenging whiteness is being taught in some form or another on most training courses. I mean, maybe the way the lecturers reacted to me disagreeing, maybe more stronger than maybe you'd get. I don't know. I think a lot of people are just keeping their heads down and not saying anything. But I have had lots of people sending me materials and saying, this is exactly what we're getting. And I just can't wait to get this training over with. So it certainly isn't, like one extreme course that's being held up as an example. It's that it is totally rife across the whole of the UK.
Mhm.
And it does seem to be getting worse, actually, from what people tell me.
Mhm. Well, you mentioned that they said that psychoanalytic theory is a white
Yeah.
theory. And one of the things that in my program, there was a lot of contradiction. They would teach us something or tell us to talk about people in a certain way, and then almost in the next breath be teaching something that was more classically oriented, more I don't know how to really I guess more conventionally accepted prior to this CRT and critical thinking, critical theory, if you will. And so they're really in contradiction to each other, because for instance, like person-centered counseling, Rogerian therapy, where you see the individual as having a unique phenomenological view. And then we talk about racial identity development, where you have this very cookie cutter, here's how white people think, here's how Black people think. So you could see this contradiction. But what's interesting about them actually calling a particular theory that's kind of a bedrock theory white, that implies that they want to, what are they teaching? Is it going to be all turned over and now we are a school of critical pedagogy?
Well, that exactly. I mean, most of the established early psychologists and psychoanalysts were white and European. And those are the ideas that are the foundation of most psychology. So if you're saying that psychological theories are white and that's somehow bad, what do you do about that? Like,
Yeah.
what am I supposed to do about that? Do I then ignore everything you've just taught me because it's been taught by white people?
Hmm.
Am I supposed to just kind of be skeptical of all of these theories, just kind of sort of use them a little bit but not too much because then I'm too white? they
Hmm.
they don't they just leave you with these things. Oh, they're white theories, and that, you know, that's a problem.
Mhm.
Okay, if it's a problem, what do you want me to do about that? Should I not use them all? How, you know? And then
Mhm.
if you ask those sort of questions, it's outrageous that you're asking the questions, and it's because they don't know.
Mhm.
When you push this, you say, okay, so they're white theories. So what do we do about that? They haven't got an answer.
Mhm.
They just, it's just their way of signaling that that they've got some kind of virtue or some kind of knowledge. And then when you ask them, they don't have anything to say. So you just sort of think, okay, but what are we doing then? Are we doing critical theory? Are we doing psychotherapy? What is this?
Mhm.
And that, I don't think they've even thought it through. And I saw a lot of contradiction in that psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. It is very much based on the individual and really trying to find out what's going on in that individual's mind. And that can be really unique, and it takes a long time. There's a lot of emphasis on psychoanalysis about how long it takes for the patient to trust you and for you to try to understand them. And yet they were teaching these ideas, which says essentially from the moment you see them, you know things about
Mhm.
them. You know what's going on in their mind. If they're white, they're a racist. You don't need to listen to them. And you
Mhm.
think, well, that just doesn't go. And it seemed like a lot of the lecturers, they were kind of going in and out of psychotherapy and then critical theory, and they didn't realize that they were doing it. It's almost like they couldn't separate the two. Whereas because I've learned a lot about critical theory in my degree, I was thinking, oh, hang on, you're not doing psychotherapy now. You're now doing a Marxist analysis of the patient. That's
Mhm.
not psychoanalysis. That's not psychotherapy. But it's almost like they couldn't recognize that. They lumped the whole thing together. And there was so many internal contradictions. And I think it's why they reacted so strongly to me, because I was pointing out that this doesn't work, and the thing that they'd been doing for so long doesn't work. It's got these contradictions,
Mhm.
and it was just like it was painful for them to realize that and be challenged on it, because they saw themselves as so kind of wise and intellectual, and then
Mhm.
you just poke it a little bit, and you say, well, no, that doesn't work, and they just can't, they can't
Mhm.
cope.
Mhm. Yeah, it felt to me like watching a profession having an identity crisis. And it felt the contradiction was so present and so difficult to speak to, as you point out, that it there's this great fragility to it, and it feels morally bankrupt and intellectually bankrupt at this point. That was my feeling of it. I again, with the more subtle inclusion of the critical, I guess, material, the curriculum, it was like I had that one course, and then all of my other courses, it felt like it was a graft onto them. So it was like, okay, you're going to write your case conceptualization, and now you have to do this. In addition to all these other segments of the paper, you have to add one in about multiculturalism. So it was just like this little graft that was kind of it. In a way, it was like it was sugar coated, because it was possible to be honest and still speak to it. You could say, okay, well, we have to go through all the intersectional qualities and talk about how those could or couldn't, could potentially be impacting this case. But it was kind of easy to sidestep that for the most part. And it sounds like in yours it wasn't. For mine, it was that one class, which I did file a grievance, and I had some issues around that went on for a long time for me. But in the rest of the program, it was mostly through communications that I was receiving from administration, that all students were receiving. Like, we would get these big bulletins about defunding the police, or about how we were supposed to feel about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, or about different political things. So it's very overtly political coming from them. But in most of the classes, again, it was like a graft. But one of the things that comes through in your story is how in your face it really was. And you were given opportunities to challenge it directly, which feels like a blessing and a curse, probably. In some ways, I feel like when you're allowed to skate through this, you might end up absorbing it and then perpetuating it.
Mm.
And in your case, being so heavily confronted with it, it's like it gave you something to say, no, that doesn't sound right. And I felt like it was hard for me to find those opportunities, because it was so subtle in some of my classes.
I think with mine, it was another contradiction that they kept doing, because they kept saying, we really want to hear what you think. We really want your feedback. We
Mm,
really need to have more and more conversations about race. We need to be having anti-racist conversations. And you say, okay, I'm going to have a conversation. And then it's outrageous that you've had a conversation. And you think, but
mhm,
you've just told me to do that. You literally have asked me what I think, and you've encouraged me to. You've given me a space and
mhm,
asked me what I think, and then but they don't they don't actually want you to actually say what you think in those
uh-huh,
spaces. So it's very much like a trap. And I was just saying to them, "But this is what you're telling me," and
mhm,
it's so illogical. But I think with them, I think the issue was that one of the course lead, who was I was having regular contact with, was really a true believer in
mm,
critical theory. It was quite obvious early on, and to challenge it was to challenge her whole being. That's
mhm,
how it felt. It felt that I was hurting her. When I was
mm,
saying, look, Robin DiAngelo says this, and this is why it's racist. It was like she took it so personally, and I was not saying anything about her as a person. I
mhm,
was saying, this is why it's wrong. This is the idea. I was quoting the reading materials that have been sent me, and I was saying, look, you know, but she felt that it was a personal attack on her. And I think, to what you said about how fragile people were, there was several people on this course who were in positions of power, and teaching, and lecturers, who were so fragile. And I could not believe that this was an academic institution. I was there as a student, I'm a trainee. It's sort of incumbent on me to ask questions, because that's what a student does. That's how you
mhm,
gain information. And that they could not tolerate somebody asking questions. I just thought, but that's isn't that being a good student?
mhm,
Just trying to understand something. And I think it really was that they couldn't tolerate curiosity about all of these contradictions, because as you say, it just shows the whole thing up as this just
mhm,
doesn't work, and they didn't want to accept that it doesn't work.
mhm,
Um, and that was the issue. But it was quite, yeah, it was quite overt. And the whole whiteness thing kept coming up again and again. And even
mhm,
when I'd made complaints about it, I thought, well, at least they'll think I'm wrong. They won't change their minds, but they might not push it so much.
mhm,
But they didn't. And I think it was almost like they saw themselves as um more emboldened by the fact that somebody was disagreeing, that
mhm, mhm.
finally they got to sort of rebel, and sort of stand up for what's right against
Yeah,
this horrible person. And
you got to be a scapegoat for whiteness.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And
Mm,
they just weren't listening to what I was saying. They had a sort of fantasy idea of me and what I was saying,
mhm,
and they were just totally misinterpreting it. And they
mhm,
kept telling me I was speaking inappropriately about race.
mhm,
And I kept saying, what have I said? What have I said? And then eventually they backed down and said, it's the tone of voice, the way that you said it. It was the
mhm,
way it made people feel. You oppressed people with your speech. All of these kind of, it's so predictable. And it's almost laughable how predictable they were. All the language, the language of trauma and oppression. And you just think I would feel embarrassed if I was that predictable, putting
mhm.
aside the fact that it's an evil, hateful ideology.
Yeah.
Just the fact that I'm just,
You're speaking a
so
script.
I'm speaking a script. I'd feel like, oh my God, what have I become?
Yeah.
And they didn't seem to. I don't think they realize that they're doing it. I think it's they couldn't see it, and it was remarkable from people who are supposed to have kind of psychological insight and be aware
Right.
be
That's
aware of
stunning.
themselves. I know,
It's so stunning to see these
I
people
know.
who are teaching you the principles of human psychology then do something that's so obvious that it's really, really, it was so shocking to me to be in a graduate program that that didn't know its own mission to this
Yeah,
extent.
and didn't seem to have any self-awareness, and
Mhm,
was kind of like psychology, like 101. They didn't even know. It was obvious that groupthink was happening, that
mhm, mhm,
they couldn't see that. You think, but you're a psychologist, you're not sort of supposed to sit back and look at these things and be aware of what's happening. But it was always, they were sort of psychoanalyzing everything that was outside of them, society, other
Mm-hmm.
people, other groups,
Mm-hmm.
people in business, lawyers, everything outside of them was game to psychoanalyze and criticize and have theories about, but they wouldn't look at the dynamics of what was happening in them. And I just couldn't believe it. And this was at a time I was there when a lot of stuff was coming out in the press in the UK about the Gender Identity Service. One of the safeguarding leads won a tribunal against the Tavistock because she was essentially bullied for speaking out against transgender ideology and how it was affecting the patients there, and that there were the parents that were bringing in young people who were, and they were expressing kind of homophobic ideas, that they didn't want to have a gay son, they'd rather have a trans daughter or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And she spoke up about this, and she won her tribunal. It was all on the press. It was on the front page of the tabloid news here, and it was just not talked about at the Tavistock. And I was thinking, shouldn't we as a group sort of, if we're supposed to be introspective and
Mm-hmm.
reflective, shouldn't we be thinking about what's happening? And it was just silence. And it was the most oppressive thing
Mm-hmm.
I'd ever experienced in a place that's supposed to be about
You were
talking.
right there where this is happening. And
Yeah.
so I had a similar, but more, again, it's at a more of a buffer between these experiences, but I had a similar feeling when I realized I was listening to Jordan Peterson talk quite a bit. I found him to be very inspirational, and I liked his take on a lot of things. And I had this, it was like an unspoken, I just knew I could not bring his name up. And he's a very prominent psychologist who was speaking publicly, and really he was very popular at the time that I was going through an applied psychology program. And yet I knew his name. I would have been persona non grata if I had said his name in a class.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, these are the things that are going on in our field, and yet
Yeah.
they're untouchable here because they don't strike the right political tone.
It's, I mean, Jordan Peterson's probably the most famous psychologist at this point. He's certainly sold more books. I mean, his books have sold millions. And he is talking about issues that are happening in the field of psychology. So you would think that people would want to reflect on that and think about, but no, it's just a bubble.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to properly engage with the outside world. It seems like a real arrogance, actually. It's almost like we're in this special club, and we know everything, and everything outside of that is just, it's not important, or it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't need to be thought about, or if it does need, if we are going to think about it, we're just going to criticize it and look down. It was like real kind of intellectual hubris. And
Mm-hmm.
actually, from my experience, is that these people were not very bright. I mean, that was another
Mm-hmm.
thing. I was
Mm-hmm.
quite surprised by their lack of knowledge about psychology, but also just about history and about lots of things, that they really acted like they knew everything. And actually, they weren't very impressive in
Mm-hmm.
terms of, intellectually. I was, felt like I was being taught by people that um didn't know all that much.
I had a little bit of that too. I had a few teachers in my program that were really good and that I learned quite a bit from. And then I had a number of them that just seemed very young and very naive and very just taught on a very superficial level. So it wasn't necessarily that they weren't bright. It was just that they seemed inexperienced and ill-equipped to be teaching. And did you have a sense that other students were experiencing this the way that you were, or did you feel like you were all alone?
I felt very much like I was all alone. Yeah, I don't know what the students thought. I generally think they agreed that they sort of bought into critical race theory, and I think there was a very much an idea, if we're being taught this, if the whole institution's teaching this, then it must be right, and that I must be wrong because
Mm-hmm.
I'm just a student. All these people with all these qualifications, the teachers, they're teaching this thing. So I was kind of mad to disagree with it, that it was like, but that's the established thing that they're teaching here, so how can you disagree? So there was very much like I was very singled out That's how it felt.
Mhm.
Um,
Did
mm,
you, for me, I was one of, there were some older students, but not very many. I'd say maybe like 20% of the students were a little bit older, maybe even fewer, maybe 15%. And then most of them were right out of college. And so I was older. I had done other things and was returning to school. It sounds like you also had a career and then were returning. Did you, what was that the demographic makeup of your program as well? Were they mostly younger than you?
I think they were probably sort of similar age as me.
Okay.
Yeah, but although I was in quite a small group, but there was a larger group where I think there was more of a mix. But I think even amongst the lecturers that were a bit older, actually it was they seemed to be the ones that were the worst. They seem to be very, for people that go on and on about diversity, they really didn't seem to have an idea of, when they were talking about politics, it was just like a kind of left-wing narrative was correct, and it was almost like they didn't really understand the conservative or libertarian or any different points of view. It was like things that I was saying were like things that they'd never heard before.
Mm,
It was like, I take things from, I don't really know how to describe myself politically, but I think there's, we're all liberals in some way. We're all conservatives in another way. But, it's all part of us internally. We move
mhm,
in and out of the political spectrum, I think, in ourselves. And it's more about having the right approach in the right moment. But there was no sense of that. There was more of a sense of just goodies and baddies. And
mhm,
that if you had a different political view, you must have been a sort of baddie.
mhm,
Um, and I was surprised to experience that from people sort of in their 50s. And I was just thinking, what have you done with your life? If you're not
mhm,
mixed with different people, it was, maybe they haven't. I think a lot of them just go into the field of psychotherapy and they don't mix outside of that. And it's like a sort of, like I said, a group think
mhm,
developed where they're not exposing themselves to different views, which is why it's so shocking when someone does question something.
mhm,
That's what it was like. Um, but it was, I still, even though it's been so long, there's a part of me that still can't sort of understand what's happened, or I'm still in shock. I
mhm.
don't know how people can, and when I hear your case as well, I just think, how is this happening? I mean, I know intellectually why it's happening. I know all the arguments about how woke ideologies developed and so on. When you go through it, you still find it hard to process, I think, emotionally. Like you just think, how could people do this?
Yeah, as you were
Um,
talking about the timeline of your experience, I kept thinking how brave you were to continue going through that and how hard that must have been for you because, I in my own case, it was really difficult for me. I had after that first course, that multicultural course where you used an example earlier where you asked a question. You said, "How can you explain to me why this is white? This theory is whiteness. What does that mean?" And
mm,
that tone, and you emphasize the fact that the way that you asked it was very much like you were asking it right now. Well, I was similarly very careful with the way that I approached all of my pushback in this course because it felt like if I were having an intellectual discussion with a peer, I would very comfortably be exchanging these ideas. But I was surrounded by what felt like hostile people and a teacher who felt irrational and strange. And it was a strange situation. And so uh, I asked, I pushed back like a very small amount compared to how much I objected to what we were being taught. And it was my conscience telling me, you have to say something about this. I'm sitting here nervous and anxious and in person around all these people who are basically, either they're on her side or I don't know their thoughts, but it felt very scary and intimidating. And
yeah,
I did it in that same way that you described. I mean, it's very diplomatic, very reverential, and like just would you mind explaining? Because you talked about this and then you talked about that, and I'm trying to make that line up. Would you talk about that a little bit more? And the emotional responses that I got from the teacher were they were really it was like you hit the nail on the head when you were talking about how they're carrying so much contradiction that if you poke at it, they don't know how to handle that, and so they kind of explode at you. And I was a wreck after
Mm.
that. I can remember one of the classes I went and sat in the bathroom right afterwards and cried. I just went into a toilet stall and cried because it was so scary. It was such a terrible social situation to be in. And then I moved to an online program, and it was a lot easier after that. But I still had that same sense of internal just it's a very stressful feeling. It's very uncomfortable. And you were put in that position over and over in your
Mm.
course.
I think it's kind of psychologically abusive in a way. It is like luckily, fortunately, before this experience, I've never really been bullied or been in a kind of abusive relationship or anything like that. And I've sort of thought, oh, this is what people it must feel when they're experiencing those things, because it was like all the sort of classic things that people talk about, walking on eggshells,
Mm-hmm.
never knowing, having to watch what you say, having to watch what you do, being made to feel guilty about
Mm-hmm.
just simple things, being made to feel shamed, being made to feel like there's something wrong with you when there isn't, questioning your own sanity. It was like, it was really, and I was, like I said, I was sort of in my 30s when I was doing this. I was quite, I'd worked with a lot of mentally unwell people, so I was quite kind of strong in myself. I wasn't like a kind of 21-year-old who hadn't really experienced life, but
Mm-hmm.
it was so hard, and it did feel like I'm in a kind of an abusive situation at this
Mm-hmm.
point. What do I do? Like, I don't want to continue with having a relationship with these people, but I need to pass this course. And it felt like they
Mm-hmm.
knew that, and they had this kind of power over me. And I sort of thought, gosh, this is what people must talk about when people talk about abuses of power and being put in difficult situations. I thought, oh gosh, that's what I'm going through. And
Mm-hmm.
it was horrible. It was really, it really affected my health. It was just, it was so hard. It's like staying in a relationship with your abuser in a way. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate. Obviously, it's not as terrible as, real proper abuse, but there
Mm-hmm.
was something about kind of some weird narcissistic structure going on where it's like they knew they had this kind of power over me, and it was horrible. It's horrible to feel powerless.
Mm-hmm.
It's really a horrible thing. And to feel that people can, you've got to please these people who are the ones that are going to mark you and put you
Mm-hmm.
through, and you know that they're bullying you, you
Mm-hmm.
know that they've sort of got it in for you. It's really mentally, it was very, very hard. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm still sort of, I still think I've got a little bit of anxiety from it
Mm-hmm.
about just people, just trusting people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm better. I think I'm a lot better now, but I think initially, after the first year or so, I've very found it, my view of people changed a bit, and I was less trusting and more on edge, more sort of looking out for, even in my nursing, I was sort of waiting for something to happen. If I was in a room on my own with someone, I was thinking, well, better watch what I do. They could report me, or I sort of wasn't as trusting of my colleagues as I used to be. I was sort of thinking of sort of filtering what I was saying.
It's like the
It,
fabric of social dynamics
yeah,
changed.
yeah, exactly. And
Mm-hmm.
it is a kind of a bullying, and it's just, and I think it's so fascinating how you're in a completely different country to me, and yet we've had experiences that sound so similar. And
Mm-hmm.
I just find that it's fascinating how this is happening. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's definitely a unified application of this curriculum, if
Hmm.
nothing else. I mean, it seems definitely somebody decided we're all going to adopt this way of thinking. It's not organic. It's a something. I don't know that much about that, and I don't even really speculate on that because I could, it would just sound like I was going wild places because I don't have the research to prove it, but it definitely feels that way. Um, and when you were talking about how they invited you to speak about race and then
Mhm.
would criticize how you spoke about race, that makes me think about the struggle sessions
Yeah.
and how this multiculturalism course that I took really felt like a struggle session. It was, we were invited to write to the teacher about our difficult feelings that we were having, and then she would write back to us how to interpret those. And so it was like this, through difficulty, through being vulnerable, you will come to say things the way that we want you to say them. And we even had we the school had, probably still has, a racial segregated groups. So they had a white accountability group and a Black affinity group. So you could join based on your racial identity. Later on, they changed the white group to also be an accountability group because I think, or I'm sorry, an affinity group, because I think that they were tiptoeing around that thing, that very thing that your school did so blatantly. This school's trying to sort of be sneaky about it. And we're gonna kind of soft sell this a little bit more. At least that's what they were doing when I was there. I'm no longer enrolled either. But one thing I wanted to ask you about, I was really struck by this part in the documentary where you said that critical theory or developing a critical consciousness means that it's sort of antithetical to being happy. If you're happy, you're doing it wrong. You're sort of you've adopted the system way of thinking, and you are aligning yourself with the privileged. And to really have a critical consciousness means that you have to be resentful and, I don't know, unhappy. You're in strife, depressed.
Well, it's a term that they were using on my course, this idea of false consciousness. So that you almost, if you're happy, it's like you're lying to yourself. So we live in a terrible society. There's all sorts of you must have been traumatized. You must feel all this guilt and shame about your identity, and you're either oppressed or you're oppressor, and both of those are kind of bad. We live in a patriarchal system, and it's awful. So if you're going about your life and you're sort of comfortable with that, i.e., you're happy, you maybe feel a kind of sense of belonging in your family, your community, and you look out at the world and you think it's largely okay, not necessarily perfect, but you can find things that make you happy, and you can enjoy people, and you can enjoy life. Well, that must mean you've somehow turned away, and you're sort of essentially lying to yourself about the nature of reality. You're lying to yourself about all the oppression, so you're just ignoring it. So they see it as almost a defensive structure. Happiness itself is a kind of a defensive structure that shields you from the reality of the hellscape that you're living in. This is, to me, really is like a struggle session. It's like you're being broken down and being made to feel that that seeing the world negatively, having a kind of paranoia that everybody's against you, being hyper aware of your skin color and other people's skin colors, and who's oppressing who all the time, which is, to me, is a profoundly, I think, nihilistic and depressive way to live. That means that you're sane. You might be depressed and you might be miserable, but you are in contact with reality. That's how they would see it. And to me, it's a complete inversion of psychotherapy and mental health.
Isn't that amazing that people would go to a counselor in order to become miserable?
To become miserable, yeah, exactly. You've got to get rid of your joy and your happiness, and any, I felt it on the course. I was being told that I was wrong for, essentially, I don't feel shame and guilt about my skin color. I'm not particularly aware of my skin color, and I don't particularly like to pay too much attention to other people's skin color. And I find that means that I can enjoy people. Actually, I can enjoy being me, and I can, every time I meet a person, I can sort of be open-minded about who they are, and I can have that joy of that spontaneous interaction. What's this person about? I don't know. That's really fun. But I was being made to feel that was wrong, and that I needed to be kind of fragile and hypersensitive and paranoid all the time. And then I was being a good psychotherapist, and it was just such an inversion. It was, to me, you couldn't make it up. And I just think I think there's lots of reasons why this is happening, but I do think it's the sort of people that are unfortunately going into the field of psychotherapy now that I think we really shouldn't be there. They're people that are very, very emotional and often have some of their own issues. And they get drawn to critical theory, I think, because it validates their grievances and their anger and their hatred, and they can feel that they're all powerful. Critical theory really gives people a sense of omnipotence and kind of that they understand the whole world now.
Hmm.
They
Hmm.
understand everyone, and they understand what's good and what's bad.
Hmm.
And yeah, it was just I'm still kind of coming to terms with it, but it is remarkable what's happened. And as you say in the documentary, I do explore that. I do explore how uh, some, I think there's some very useful ideas within psychoanalysis, but they became weaponized by a group of people who really weren't interested in people's well-being at all.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's amazing that we find ourselves here in this
Yeah,
place. But
yeah.
do you have any hope for the future? And I guess I also want to ask you, maybe I should ask you that very last, because I have one other question for you, and it's since you've worked in this field as a mental health nurse for quite some time, and now you've been exposed to these trainings that so you see how counselors and psychologists are being trained. Do you see this trickling into the field, or is this still mostly academic in your experience?
No, I think it's trickling into the field. Like I've had people contact me and say that. I even when I was applying for other training courses, I had some replies back from people sort of talking about my identity and asking, and essentially saying we're looking for sort of black lesbian therapists,
Oh, okay.
being very open about real emphasis on identity.
Hmm.
I think there's some still really good therapists out there, so I don't want to, throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I do think generally the field has become. I think it's nowhere near as robust or as good as it used to be. I think the standards have gone down
Hmm.
rapidly. I think there's too many people going into therapy. I think everybody wants to be therapists, and they're doing it with very quickly, and they're often like I said, not always the brightest people, and I think that they're not being trained very well at all. The training is awful. So it does seem to be trickling down a bit. And I know that most of the psychotherapists who are the good ones, they just get their qualification and they try to keep away from the institutions. They just set up their own private practice.
Hmm.
Um, and that's how they get by, really.
When you mentioned earlier that a lot of the people in your program were not very bright, were you talking about the students or the professors? Because I took it to be the professors, but now that you
Yeah.
say this, I'm thinking about the students that I was working with, and I feel like there was a lot of, and I'm not necessarily criticizing anybody's intelligence per se, but there was a lot of bias and activist
Yes.
motivation within the student
Yeah.
classes.
Yeah, definitely. I saw that. I think I mean, I guess it's that I think the profession hasn't been able to withstand the pressure of politics and activism that's going on outside it. And it should have done, it's supposed to be a profession that thinks about things and doesn't react, but it,
Hmm.
it doesn't seem that it's been able to do that. And you do see kind of activism in both the lecturers and the students, and they sort of collude with each other. So it's
Hmm.
almost like you get points for being a student, being a good student, if you agree with the activists. If you're
Hmm.
activists together,
Hmm.
then you're going to pass and you're going to
Hmm.
fly through because you're being a good student, or you're being a good activist and agreeing
Right.
with the lecturer. So there's a real bias for essentially anybody that genuinely wants to think critically marks themselves out as that there's something wrong with them, which is crazy because it's a profession that's about talking and thinking. So I don't know.
Absolutely. And so the question I started to ask you, do you feel hopeful? And what do you see happening from here?
Um, I don't feel hopeful at the moment, not in the short term. I think I don't know what will happen. I think that I know people, just ordinary people, that say that they would never see a therapist now, which is a
Mhm.
shame. People that do have genuine issues, and they say, yeah, but I could never go to a therapist because of my identity, or because I'm rich, or because I'm this or that, or I've seen what's happened, what's happening in that profession, and I wouldn't go near those sorts of people. So it may take time for new forms of therapy or new kind of institutions to develop, but I think we're a long way off of that. I think for the most part, people will just avoid therapy. And I think I think it will take a long time before the training changes. I mean, even with the gender identity stuff, that's still an ongoing battle. Like, it feels like it's very much one step forward, two steps back. We make, like, in England, we've recently had puberty blockers banned because there was no evidence for them. And there's been a lot of pushback with regards to how kind of gender affirming care and affirming a transgender person's, identity. And it feels like we're getting somewhere, and then we have government kind of pushing back against that, and it's so hard, which is something which just seems so obvious. It's just we're just talking about biology here, and even that is such a battle. So I'm not hopeful in the short term, but I think long term, I don't think this could continue. I think eventually people will just avoid, therapy, and then there will always be the desire for people to heal and for people to seek out support. So it may well be new centres or new groups of people will come together to provide that. And we were seeing it a little bit already with sort of things that you're doing and some of the people that you're speaking to, and that we're grouping together a bit more, aren't we? And we're naming the problem and we're coming together to think about it. And it may well be another decade or so before something more solid forms.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. It's really nice to meet you finally and hear more about how this has happened to you. I'm so sorry that your career was derailed by this. It's a painful
I'm sorry
experience
for you as well. Yeah, I know. Say the same to you.
Yeah. Where can people find you and your documentary online? Do you want to say it out loud?
Yeah, so my documentary is on YouTube. It's called Trans, Racist and Woke: How Psychology Went Mad. It's with an organisation called New Culture Forum. If you just Google Amy Gallagher, How Psychology Went Mad, I'm sure you'll find it. And I'm also crowdfunding for my legal case. So my crowdfund is on GoFundMe /Stand Up to Woke. And on the crowdfund, you can find there's lots of information there. Even if you don't want to donate, there's lots of things to look at and updates about my case that you could read and links to various things. So it's worth a look. Yeah, and I'm on Twitter at Stand Up to Woke.
Awesome. I will include all of those links in the video description for people to follow. Thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you, Leslie. I enjoyed that. Thank you.